kind of realizing in retrospect. This realizing in retrospect is a theme in my life.
Hello, Az. Thank you so much for joining us today. Could you please introduce yourself for us?
Hi, I'm Az Klymiuk. I'm an Indigenous scholar in science in the Department of Biological Sciences, but more importantly, I'm a citizen of the Métis Nation of Alberta, and I have family connections in Saddle Lake, Goodfish Lake, Cree First Nation. I identify as Cree, Métis, and Slavic. I'm not claimed by my Slavic family, but they originate from the Carpathian Mountains of what is still today Ukraine, they're holding it down. In terms of where I grew up and where I'm from, my home is in Treaty 8 territory in northern Alberta. It's the land that built my bones. It's the land that raised me, that nourished me. We practiced subsistence-based lifeways while I was growing up. And so that is a key part of my identity, and the place that I'm from is a key part of my identity too. So I always like to introduce that land. And in fact, I grew up kind of near the confluence of the Notikewin and Peace Rivers. And so the water that carved that land and nourished the land is also water that nourished me. Today, I'm here in Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg. And Winnipeg is, of course, another river confluence site between the Assiniboine and Red Rivers. And as we were mentioning kind of before we started recording here, this place has been a gathering place of nations for a time beyond memory. And so I'm really pleased to be here and to contribute to the University of Manitoba.
That was a beautiful introduction, probably one of the most beautiful introductions I've ever heard. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you.
I want to know more about your journey in science.
I had the opportunity to sit in on some teachings by Wilfred Buck, who is a Cree elder knowledge keeper. And he said that one of a Cree way of knowing and Cree practices of science involve journeying and travel. I mean, lots of other things too, but he highlighted travel, and I feel like I have been doing quite a lot of traveling to get where I am now, both in terms of philosophically and also like physically. So my journey in science, I was thinking about this earlier today, and it probably starts in school, like in elementary school or in high school. I was always kind of like the geeky, quiet kid, and then the geeky, not so quiet kid. But one of the things that, like I said, land is important to me and nature is important to me, and the scientific disciplines that encompass that, at least in Western educational systems, are biology. And so I think I was put on the track to becoming a biologist on the basis of the fact that I wanted to know about the world around me, and biology seemed to be the only way to do that was socially acceptable or intellectually acceptable, or that would actually translate to a career in some way. I mean, we also had like a wilderness education or wildlife and outdoor ed course, but I was mercilessly teased and harassed by my settler peers in that class. And even though I think back now and I'm like, I would much rather be living in the bush. Like right now, the Saskatoons are starting to ripen, and I would love to be out there berry picking right now, as opposed to running back over to the lab to work on culturing. And so I think if I trace back the start of my journey in science, it's probably there, just being kind of filtered into science as science being one of the only ways to engage with the questions about the world that really interested me. And it hasn't been a bad journey. I'm not saying that anything about this has been terribly bad. There have been good points and bad points. But I think that's where it started. And so I went off to the University of Alberta to do my undergraduate, and I kind of kind of threw darts at different majors. I picked a bunch of things that I thought were interesting to me, and I signed up and I was accepted to the Bachelor's of Science in Paleontology. And I think that that was a really lucky and really good thing to have happened to me, because the structure of that undergraduate degree program is basically a really, or at least when I took it, it was a really kind of broad-based introduction to Western scientific philosophy as applied through the lens of natural history. And so I gained an incredible amount of broad information about how the planet worked, how evolution worked, organismal diversity, including plants, invertebrates, vertebrates. I mean, it was really, really a broad degree program. I mean, it specialized into things like paleobotany and comparative vertebrate anatomy and the rest of it. But I also got to take cool courses like geoarchaeology. And what other degree track allows you to pick something like that? I learned a lot, and I think that it opened my mind up to like a whole array of different questions and things that I hadn't thought about. And then crucially, it also, and this is something that I'm kind of realizing in retrospect, this realizing in retrospect is a theme in my life. But I realized in retrospect that a lot of the things that I was also learning were about the historical precedents and the philosophies that underpin Western science. A lot of Western science, particularly in biology, is very driven by great thinkers. You know, we have Darwin, we have Huxley, I mean, I can just keep listing them, right? And a lot of the ways that they thought about problems in biology were, of course, influenced by their religious background, their sociocultural training, and understanding the historical context for the development of what we call science, big S science, has been really useful for me, because there are a lot of things in the way that I relate to the world that are not the same as my colleagues and peers relate to questions in biology, or even like being out on the land. We're looking through different lenses, and understanding where that comes from in kind of the history of science has been really useful for me in just recognizing that I'm a fish swimming in water and there is a glass on the outside of the tank, and occasionally I'm going to bump up against it. And that's kind of my metaphor for what it's like being somebody who was raised in different sets of cultural values and different ways of thinking about the world. Started off in paleontology. Now I do field-based ecology and plant-fungal interactions right now in wetlands, but probably eventually more broadly in a number of other ecosystems. How'd I get from digging up dirt to, also digging up dirt, except looking at deep past versus looking at contemporary systems? That itself is a long journey over most of the continent. After I finished a Master's of Science, also at the University of Alberta, I went down to the University of Kansas, where I started working on fossil fungi, and rapidly recognized in reading the literature that anything I could say about the fossil fungi I was describing was going to be stories, just so stories at best, you know, like the Rudyard Kipling just so stories, which are themselves deeply problematic. And recognizing how deeply problematic that suite of children's and colonial literature is, I started thinking, okay, well, maybe I should not be doing deeply problematic things with my science. We don't know a whole lot about what fungi are doing in inundated systems. Heck, we don't know a whole lot about what fungi are doing in any system. It's this remarkably understudied kingdom of life, like this entire evolutionary lineage that we don't spend enough time studying, thinking about, talking about, or integrating into our worldviews. And in particular, I was working on things that were in aquatic systems in the past, and they'd been fossilized in these, prehistoric wetlands. And I'm trying to draw parallels with what we know about fungi in extant or living wetlands and recognizing that we don't know things. So what was I going to do? Make up just so stories or actually go and investigate it? And I decided I'm going to go and I'm going to figure out how to become a microbial ecologist and start answering some of these questions. So that's probably a long-winded way of describing that journey. There's lots of side shoots and backtracks and circle arounds, and there's lots of other trajectories to that journey that I could go off on, but that's the basic journey. And so I've been here at the University of Manitoba for about 1.5 years. Is that right? I think so. And
I take your word for it.
Time flies. And we're getting started on some of these questions and finding out some interesting information and finding out that some of the things we thought were true are true, some of them aren't, and some of them are just really complicated, which to me is fun. I like things that are complicated.
Yeah, those are usually the most interesting projects that one can take on. It's fun to look at. It's fun to find out, oh, this is something I can do, and then going through it is also can be really exciting and interesting. You mentioned that there were like questions you had when you were growing up, and like you felt like science was the one that can guide you, or you can just like look at science, use it, and maybe answer those questions or explore those questions a bit more. What were some of those questions?
Yeah, so first I want to say that I don't think science is the only way to understand the world, or rather, I don't think capital S, big S Western science is the only way to understand the world. Every nation on this planet practices scientific methods. A scientific method, you break it down really simply, it's like experimentation, observation, and then repeat that a few times to make sure it's repeatable and like actually define something that is true, actually works. Exactly. So any way of doing anything is practicing science. Some of the questions that I had, I mean, I was always just deeply fascinated about how plant communities functioned, like why certain trees would be in certain places, why certain medicinal plants would be associated with other plants. I was just deeply fascinated by geomorphology when I was growing up. I mean, I didn't know it was called geomorphology, but we lived up near the banks of the Peace River, and where we lived, there's like vegetated sand dunes all the way down the river. And it's just, it's such a cool plant community to walk through. And then you're walking through these absolutely beautiful barcane sand dunes that have got pine trees growing out of them. And I was like, how did this happen? Like, why is it here? And then you drive like 5 miles over and you're in like deep clay, like 70 feet deep clay all the way down. What caused that? And so I think I was just, I looked upon science and like choosing to be in science as primarily access to people who knew things and could tell good stories. I think I looked upon my profs largely as like, through that lens of elder, like here's somebody who knows things, here's somebody who can tell me how things work, and here's somebody who can guide me to ask better questions and find answers to questions that they couldn't answer. And so for me, starting out a journey in science was not necessarily choosing to be a research scientist. I was just like, okay, well, here's a collection of people, much like a collection of books, that I can access and gain answers to things that I see around me. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. A funny story, I had been walking out again in that area around the Peace Sandhills, and I saw a pine tree. This would have been, I think I would have been about 17 maybe. I had a camera at that point, like an old point and click DSLR, like a really old cheap camera. And I had seen a pine tree that had holes packed in it, and they were just like in lines all the way down. And I was like, it was so regular. Like, I thought this must be like a cellular feature, like this must be a disease or something. I took a photo of it, and I was like, casually, quietly kind of shop this photo around to my botany professors and be like, do you know what causes this? Assuming that botanists knew anything about sapsuckers, because that's what does that. I've since found out. But it's one of those things that I would just see things and I'd be like, what does that? How does that work? What caused that? And really just want to know and hang on to those questions and like be constantly asking those questions. And sometimes you find the person who knows, and sometimes you spend 13 or 14 years going like, clearly I'm in the wrong science because this makes no sense to me.
I think one thing that you mentioned that is really important in science in general is to just stick to those questions. I always say that I personally just stick to problems or just questions in general much longer than most people. I don't let go easily. And I think that's really important. That's the point you're making. To like just keep asking and asking. You will find the right person along the way. Somewhere.
And it absolutely doesn't matter that pattern is caused by sapsuckers, but it matters to me because now I know.
Yes. And I think that's what, that's how you ended up asking those questions about fungi as well. Like, hey,
exactly.
We don't know enough. We don't know that we don't know enough until now. That's really important.
I mean, this is how knowledge generation happens. It doesn't happen in like a eureka moment, Archimedes jumping out of the tub. Like, that's not how the majority of knowledge acquisition in any society or any culture happens. It happens through people just being curious and being willing to think about things and follow questions. And I think that it's one of the things that defines us as humans, just this deep curiosity and a willingness to ask those questions.
Yeah, that's really important. And I hope that anyone who asks those questions also gets, at least if the person who's being asked that question doesn't know the answer, doesn't also discourage them from asking that question any further.
I think that's really true. And we see a lot of people being shut down or being guided into very narrow pathways. And I think that we are impoverished as a society by being discretized in this way, by being essentially transformed into cogs in a wheel, whether that's the wheel of enterprise or the wheel of science or the wheel of commerce or the wheel of Western capitalist society, late stage capitalism. Human beings, and we're so much more than that. And anything that pushes you into a narrow way of thinking or a narrow way of being is something to be really, I think, really, really concerned about.
That's very true. I couldn't agree more. I wonder, and I know this is a question that some people might look at it from an outer perspective, but I want it from an inner perspective. What would you say your proudest achievement is so far? And I'm not asking about something that was necessarily recognized. I know it could be that. But what is your proudest achievement?
See, that's a really hard question.
I do ask hard questions.
As somebody who is a professor and potentially a mentor to others, I should say, like, I'm proud of being a first generation scholar and having 3 different pieces of very expensive paper to hang on my wall. I should say that. But you know what? That's not what I'm proudest of. Proudest achievement is that I actually, I quit my PhD at one point, and then I later re-entered the program and actually got my PhD, but I quit my PhD at one point to go home and help my mother through some really complicated health conditions and surgeries. And making that choice, I think, is the thing I'm proudest of.
That's an amazing achievement.
Secondary to that, I'm also really proud of the garden that I started building during that time when I was away. It's very nice. I'm very pleased with. I had a lot of time, and I think, like, getting back to my fascination with just digging holes, because that seems to be like the one theme in my life. I think there's something
That's
like
calming.
deep in my personality that just really enjoys digging holes, because a lot of the gardening was digging out things like a dry water course and flower beds and the rest of it. I think it's just like something that's baked into my DNA. Bored, grab a shovel.
I think that translates both literally and metaphorically of you digging into questions in science and also actually growing a garden. Growing a garden is really hard and difficult.
Yeah, but it's really rewarding, because when you can see plants waking up, like perennials waking up after the snow, it's just so hopeful. And it reminds you that everything is both transient and permanent. Everything is like a cycle and a series, and things grow, they bloom, they flower, they fruit, they die away, they sleep for a while, and they come back.
That's a very beautiful understanding, very rich. And thank you so much for sharing that, because I don't think we value enough those personal achievements of when you stay true to your core values instead of what the society or what the community might want from you.
I think I had time earlier this week to kind of contemplate something that struck me as profound. It may not actually be profound, but earlier this week it struck me as profound that in a lot of ways, many people are motivated in Western society, our dominant Canadian or North American society. Many people are motivated in pursuit of some sort of financial stability, or, job recognition or career advancement or anything like that. And I think that this motivation comes down to something really simple. Cash can replace community in some ways. So when you have problems in your life, you need spark plugs changed on your car. If you have community, you may have a whole network of cousins or uncles or aunts or, friends who would know how to do that. Somebody would know. Somebody would be able to give you a hand. But in a society that disconnects us and fragments us from not only our broader communities, but our families, we don't have those connections. And so what do? When your vehicle breaks down? You take it to a garage and you hand over some cash. There's not anything inherently wrong with that. But I think that striving for that kind of stability, whether it comes from career advancements or from publish or perish or from chasing corporate fame, I think at the core of it's trying to replace community. Community is a lot harder to build than a bank account balance.
I had the first-hand experience of that when I moved to Canada from Iran.
Right.
All of a sudden, it's just me and my husband, and we don't know one here. And you're right. You want to even buy the smallest thing, and you're like, I don't even know who to ask where to buy this.
And there's a kind of chill and a terror, especially when you have to accomplish certain things on a deadline, and you're like, how can this be easier for me? And there are some things that in our society make it a lot easier to navigate some of those questions that give us security. And so I think in that kind of hectic and panic-inducing dominant culture, I think it's very easy to dismiss our values, our moral compasses, and the things that would help us build community and be good people that we enjoy hanging out with. I think it's easy to sway from that. I like to say, how much do you like your own company?
That's very true.
I ask myself all the time when I'm about to do something that I think is perhaps not in line with my values. I'm like, well, do you want to like your own company? Generally, I enjoy hanging out with myself. I don't need to be constantly stimulated by other people around me because I do like my own company. And I think that that's something that I'm proud of.
That's such a good point. And it's also as much as I feel like we all know it, it's also very fresh when it's talked about, because it's not talked about very often.
No. We spend a lot more time talking about how we're going to get the right Instagram shoot, right?
That was really good insight. Thank you for that. I'm going to ask for advice now. And it's also this is a selfish part of every interview I do, because as an immigrant, I just want to learn more, and I want to be more part of every community here, and I want to do my part right as well. But this is also a selfish part of every interview I do, is that what advice do you have for non-Indigenous members of our community, especially here at the university, who wants to learn more about Indigenous science and raise awareness around it?
Okay, so that's a really good question. You're good at questions.
Thank you.
I think that there are a bunch of things that non-Indigenous people can do and should do. On the should do front, I think settler and newcomer Canadians absolutely must read the reports of the Commission, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the Commission on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit Peoples. The findings are critical to moving forward in good ways. It's critical that we spend time staring that truth head on and understanding what is happening in our cultures, in our societies, in our relationships with one another. That's the first place to start. In terms of understanding Indigenous science, here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. Indigenous science and Indigenous ways of knowing the world are fractured by the genocides that have been practiced upon us. So many of us are reclaiming those ways of knowing. Some people still have access to elders who still have that knowledge. Some people are rebuilding that knowledge, others are reconnecting. We need space to do that. We need resources to do that. So non-Indigenous people can assist by helping with access to resources and being cognizant of that. It's also, I think, really useful to understand Indigenous value systems, or at least try to. I don't think you can know a system of values unless you are raised in it, unless you have people around you who are enforcing and not enforcing, but reinforcing that system of values. I think that trying, though, is very useful. Our system of values underpins the ways in which we relate to the world around us and to the questions we ask of the world around us, and in that way relate to our science and the ways we practice science. I also think, and this is where I'm going to get a little bit away from your question, but I think that in the academy we put a lot of emphasis on Indigenous science as though it's something separate, or as though Indigenous people can only practice Indigenous science. We also need Indigenous people doing basic Western science, because let's face it, science as a culture has a problem. It's predominantly white, it's exclusive, and it reinforces a narrative that was founded in colonial expansion and European empire. Those are its roots. So if we want to change the culture of science, we need a diverse array of perspectives in science. And Indigenous people should be there too. We talk a lot about how Indigenous people safeguard 80 or 85% of all biodiversity on the planet, right? we're not doing that through any new technology or any new way of understanding the world around us. We're doing that because we have a system of values that underpins how we relate to the world around us. We don't see resources, we see kin. And that comes down to values. So as much as we can talk about traditional ecological knowledge, and we can pull in two-eyed ways of knowing, none of that matters if non-Indigenous scientists aren't willing to look at their system of values, and non-Indigenous peoples generally aren't willing to look at their system of values and say, okay, well, maybe we could also look at the world around us as kin. And I don't think that's an alien concept. I mean, do you have pets? A dog or a cat? No?
Not now.
Do you have a favorite tree that you walk past?
Yeah.
You'd be really sad if that was cut down. You have a relationship with that. You have a relationship with that organism. People who do have pets, they call them their fur family. They can be devastated when they lose that family member. So these ways of relating to the world around us are not fundamentally different or alien. Indigenous people just have a more expansive view of what constitutes kin. For us, the soil and the water and the air we breathe is just as important as the dog that we pat every morning. I think that those are some of the things that will help us to build science, community, and culture in ways that are mutually reinforcing, as opposed to exclusionary, segregated, and probably mutually destructive.
Those are amazing pieces of advice. Thank you. You laid them out
perfectly a lot
for us. No, you laid them out perfectly for us. Thank you for that. I want to thank you for your time today. This was a wonderful interview.
I really want to thank you for listening and for making space. And I want to suggest that, again, if people are interested in these topics, there are so many other voices than just mine. There are brilliant minds out there who are writing amazing books, producing amazing podcasts, being active in community spaces, being politically and culturally and socially active, and get involved. Start building community. That's more important at the end of the day than writing the perfect line of code.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Az.